Hello everybody, thank you very much for joining us today. It's my great pleasure to chair this panel with my colleague Mia Münster, where panelists have a history and expertise covering design, education, practice and research in the realms of circular economy. So a few words to introduce myself, Susan Evans, and my relationship with this topic, and that of each of the panelists. So I'll start from my side. Previously a career in creative industries, London and San Francisco, and 15 years ago I moved to China and shifted my focus towards contributing to improve the well-being of people, society and the natural environment through design-led urban and rural interventions using systems and circular economy practices. Presently at the Hong Kong University Design School as a PhD candidate. So I'd like to now hand over to Mia, and perhaps Mia, you could introduce yourself.
Thank you, Susan. My name is Mia Münster. Thank you, Susan. My name is Mia Münster. I'm a postdoc at the School of Design here at the Hong Kong Polytechnic University. Before becoming a researcher, I worked for almost 20 years as a retail designer, designing stores and cafes and exhibitions, both for Danish and international brands. I study now retail design from a consumer and from a designer perspective. And one thing that I'm very interested in is how designers can contribute to the transformation to a circular economy. I recently made a study where I interviewed experienced retail designers in order to understand how they work with sustainability and how they approach circular economy in their work. And I hope that my findings from that study can be useful in the discussion today.
Absolutely, I'm sure. I'm looking forward to it. Perhaps Anne, would you like to introduce yourself? I'd like to turn to Anne Boddington. You can see Anne, please.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Nice to be back again today. Just in terms of my expertise, I'm professor actually of design innovation, which is my formal professorial title. I'm now emeritus professor. I chair the British the UK Research Excellence Framework currently, and I'm a visiting professor at 2 universities in the UK and emeritus professor at Kingston University. My connection to the circular economy is that I actually chair the UKRI board for advising on a £30 million research investigation into the circular economy. So the UK has put a lot of money into an experimental project, really around five hubs and a centre, a coordinating centre, and I'm the chair of its advisory panel. So that's really my main connection to it, apart from being an architect and a designer and a cultural geographer.
Wonderful, thank you, Anne. Looking forward to your contribution. And over to Rhoda. Rhoda, could you introduce yourself, please?
So thank you, it's lovely to be here. I'm Rhoda Trimingham and I am an academic at Loughborough University, and I've been looking at sustainability for a few too many decades now, but I have a particular focus in sustainable packaging and moving packaging and the strategies to look at design for sustainable packaging towards the circular economy, which is why I'm involved in this panel today.
Brilliant, Rhoda. We're really looking forward to your contribution and your expertise in food packaging. Now, before I move to the context and setting up this panel, what I'd like to do is I'd like to get to the next slide if it's possible. I'm going to, nope, I've gone too many now. That's it. I would like to ask everybody if you could scan this QR code, because what I'd love to do is it would help us to understand better this multi-dimensional dialogue. So if you could scan the QR code and fill that in for us, and we will sort of share the responses, obviously not with anonymously, as they come through. So we'll leave that up there for a little bit. If you can grab it, fill in the questionnaire, and yeah, that would really help us. Okay, I think people are coming to the end of the questionnaire now. Do we have something to run there? Oh, I can see. Okay, great. All right, we've got some responses coming in. Not so many, but where are you normally located? A lot of people from Hong Kong. What is your field? Design, social, performance art. Have you ever heard of the circular economy? Well, astoundingly, 8 on 9 people have heard of the circular economy. Have you ever applied the circular economy? Okay, we're looking like 6 people have not applied the circular economy. So good. Maybe we can add something today. Can you give examples? No. What do you think are the key challenges to implementing a circular economy? 8 responses. Government and business. While good intentions, it's persisted focus on behavioral control and lack of understanding process. Ranking of the order here. Oh, that's difficult for me to read. All right, I might have to come back to that one. Largest barriers. Yeah, I can't read it. Not the way that it's laid out. Sorry, guys, can't read that one. Are there any further barriers that you have personally experienced? Too much reliance on questionnaires, user experience and latest responses. Why or why not have you implemented the circular economy? Because I thought it was important. Okay, yay, okay. And have you ever taken a course to learn about the circular economy? Half no, and sort of like a third yes. So we've got a long way to go then. So education is going to be good. Do you have hopes, desires, or aspirations to implement? Oh, yes. Actually, that's a resounding yes. Okay, so, all right, we hope to contribute then today. Thank you very much, everybody, for that. That's wonderful. All right, back to the slides. Where am I on the slides? So, questionnaire, designing for a circular economy. So the topic of today requires radical changes in societal and economic models that underpin our everyday lives. Keynotes this week touched on the context of this panel, where Don Norman and Anne Boddington, who has kindly joined us today, stressed the importance of a circular economy, and Rachel Cooper, radical design. And so, as to place the contribution of this panel into context, I turn to Ezio Manzini from 2015 as echoed by Arturo Escobar in 2018, who emphasized the necessity to change our ways of being and doing, and to do this by learning how to live well. It is a transition, and so I paraphrase, it is a transition long for us, but short for world history, in which we must all learn to live, and live well, on the new islands. And in doing so, anticipate what the quality of life will be like on the emerging continent. This panel aims to contribute to learning to live well on these new islands, to contribute to a radical change in how designers might learn to apply the circular economy and contribute to this transformation. Oh. We do this from a designerly perspective. No. Sorry, guys. Oh, crumbs. All right, right. Lost a page. Oh, here we go. Yeah, okay. We'll do this from a designerly perspective. The barriers, the potential responsibility of the designer, the role of design schools in learning for a circular economy. But before I do this, what I'd like to do is to set the context of why this transformation to the circular economy is so vital. I'm going to show some NASA slides to illustrate the global issue, then show an Ellen MacArthur video to give an idea of the circular economy on how it impacts the everyday. So anybody that has no idea about the circular economy, this gives you an overview of the circular economy. So the slides then, the first one that I show is the rise in temperature. And what we can see here is a rise from industrial times, from 1960s through to 2020. Now I'm going to show a series to show this temperature rise in colour, from 1884 through to 2017. Actually, can we just go back one, please, Mia? So this is 1884. The blue indicates sort of like cold, and as we move through to red and orange, that shows that we're starting to warm up, or warmer places on the planet. This is 1884. As we go through to 1958, what we see is we start to see the world warming up. We see a little bit more yellow there and sort of like less dark blue. And then I show you sort of like 2017. What we can see is that we heated up quite a lot. And this is a contribution of the carbon dioxide that is actually releasing into our atmosphere. And so for this reason, I show you, I want to do my weatherman impersonation here, I show you the rise in carbon dioxide. And as we can see, it's exponential and unprecedented. Now I show you what that looks like in terms of a very short time series from 2002 to 2016. 2002, you can see we're down in the grey zone. It's still manageable. As we move through to 2010, we already start to warm up. That's 8 years later. And then we move to 2016, and here we have it. And that is what is causing our climatic change. And that is brought about by human intervention. That human intervention is potentially, can be tackled by the circular economy. Not only by the circular economy, but the circular economy can disrupt the system. And that's what we're going to look at today. So the panel today cannot address everything. So here, let's have a look at the Ellen MacArthur video. And this is for really just to give us an idea about what we can do as everyday citizens and what we can start to think about.
Living systems have been around for a few billion years and will be around for many more. In the living world, there's no landfill. Instead, materials flow. One species' waste is another's food. Energy is provided by the sun. Things grow, then die, and nutrients return to the soil safely. And it works. Yet as humans, we've adopted a linear approach. We take, we make, and we dispose. A new phone comes out, so we ditch the old one. Our washing machine packs up, so we buy another. Each time we do this, we're eating into a finite supply of resources and often producing toxic waste. It simply can't work long term. So what can? If we accept that the living world's cyclical model works, can we change our way of thinking so that we too operate a circular economy? Let's start with the biological cycle. How can our waste build capital rather than reduce it? By rethinking and redesigning products and components, and the packaging they come in, we can create safe and compostable materials that help grow more stuff. As they say in the movies, no resources have been lost in the making of this material. So what about the washing machines, mobile phones, fridges? We know they don't biodegrade. Here, we're talking about another sort of rethink, a way to cycle valuable metals, polymers, and alloys so they maintain their quality and continue to be useful beyond the shelf life of individual products. What if the goods of today became the resources of tomorrow? It makes commercial sense. Instead of the throw away and replace culture we've become used to, we'd adopt a return and renew one, where products and components are designed to be disassembled and regenerated. One solution Maybe to rethink the way we view ownership. What if we never actually owned our technologies? We simply licensed them from the manufacturers. Now, let's put these two cycles together. Imagine if we could design products to come back to their makers, their technical materials being reused and their biological parts increasing agricultural value. And imagine that these products are made and transported using renewable energy. Here we have a model that builds prosperity long term. And the good news is, there are already companies out there who are beginning to adopt this way of working. But the circular economy isn't about one manufacturer changing one product. It's about all the interconnecting companies that form our infrastructure and economy coming together. It's about energy. It's about rethinking the operating system itself. We have a fantastic opportunity to open new perspectives and new horizons. Instead of remaining trapped in the frustrations of the present, with creativity and innovation, we really can rethink and redesign our future.
Okay, very quickly, general idea there, change to renewables in terms of energy, don't throw anything away, make sure that sort of like it's reused or repaired and keep it for as long as possible. Okay, so moving on, the panel today cannot address everything. So we have chosen ecosystems that are challenging when it comes to the circular economy. This includes food packaging, an everyday experience, something that everybody has to interface with. Also, interiors, stores and exhibits is something that designers are continually faced with, and they are continually put up and torn down. So we're going to address these issues by starting with the key underlying principles of circular economy. And these lead us to zero waste, longevity, which means keeping the resources in the system, ways to return resources back into the system, frequently referred to as the closing loop. And then we're also going to look at citizens' role. How does design engage with citizens to enable this to happen? So the format of this panel, we will discuss these 4 areas. Among the panelists, I will invite specific panelists to address the specific areas. Then I will invite Anne Boddington through the session to discuss the meaning of this for design education and learning. And we will finish with questions and answers. So firstly, I'm going to turn to zero waste. We will start with Rhoda. So if we can bring up our panelists, please, who has been working on food packaging for some 10 years in the United Kingdom. It is this form of waste, plastic packaging, that has proven to be one of the more difficult areas to address. So Rhoda, I would love it if you could help us to understand by describing the methods used to get to zero waste. Perhaps you can touch on the hierarchy and the structure of a circular economy, ways of thinking about this, the barriers you have come across, and also the opportunities that you have found. Sounds like a lot, but I know you can do it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, so obviously this bit's concentrating on food packaging, and actually I know that you introduced it as plastic food packaging, but actually this the circular economy should be applied to all materials, and especially when it comes to packaging. So packaging tends to be a single-use item, and any material that is designed to be single-use should be avoided where possible. So firstly, looking at all resources in terms of materials. And I think the video that you showed at the beginning was a really good introduction to starting to think about food packaging and thinking about the hierarchy that then takes us down a road to circular economy thinking. And that hierarchy is also referred to as the R's. And the first is reduce. So we want to reduce resources as much as possible. And when we're discussing food packaging, actually a really important part of it is that reduction happens in terms of the food that is wasted as well as the packaging resources that are wasted. So packaging is actually really clever. It tends to protect about 10 times more in terms of resources than it uses itself. And that's because we can increase the shelf life of food. We can make sure that food gets to our plates safely without being contaminated by moisture, bacteria, bugs, heat, cold, and all sorts. And it can help us by packaging food in a way that suits lots of different people. So I'm part of the family, both adults work, and so we shop for 10 days. Therefore, we need our food to last a long time, and packaging will help support that. Somebody else may shop daily who doesn't need as much protection there. So reduce needs to focus on the food as well as the packaging, but then we also need to make sure that we are not over packaging food and that we're not over consuming it as well. So if we don't buy too much, then obviously we don't need to buy as much packaging as well. So planning and so on also fits into that reduce sphere. Then we can look at bringing in those cyclical elements to support the circular economy. And again, they've got a hierarchy. So reuse comes first, and in packaging, this is so that we can reseal it to keep things fresh, that we can perhaps take it back to the store to refill it, or we can have deposit return schemes that you're seeing quite regularly with drinks bottles, and other food products are beginning to come online as well. If you look at sort of the Loop, there's a company called Loop now working with Tesco's and other stores, which are beginning to look at return and refill models. So that comes next. And then at the end of that, we need to make sure that all the resources that we're using can be put back into the system. So this is, again, trying to emulate those cycles that we see in the natural world, where waste becomes food for another process. In this case, plastic can be recycled, paper can be recycled, and so on. And actually, that is supported by the first two options. So if we're reducing materials and we're reusing or refilling materials, then actually the amount that we are then sending to be recycled and returned reduces to the point where our infrastructure can deal with it. So at the moment in the world, we have far too many resources that even if we made them all out of recycled material, we don't have enough plants to recycle them. So what we're doing is we're burning a lot of them because we don't have the infrastructure. So if we go through those steps of reduce and reuse first, then we can use better materials so that they're better when they get kicked out of that recycling system, but we can also make it so that we can deal with the amount that we're creating. So that's in terms of the hierarchy. So I think that was the first bit of your question. The second is the barriers and opportunities. And this is where things get a bit complicated when you start working with organizations. And that is because linear life cycles, again, coming back to that video where we take, make and dispose of products and packaging. It's what organizations have done for years. It's their bread and butter. They know how it works in terms of economics, and they know how to market that to consumers. And what's happened over the years is we've built up really complicated supply chains. So there's more than one organization involved in the production and supply of every product. And so one of the barriers is getting people to talk to each other, and also to see where they can make changes to move towards a circular economy whilst retaining the economic and social value that they require as an organization. But actually, in amongst that, we can see huge opportunities. So we can bring those supply chain actors together, and we can collaborate, and we can document and discover where the value for each of those actors lies, and then we can ideate and come up with ideas for supplying their product whilst retaining that value for each of those stakeholders. So it's really important within supply chains to think about that, where they employ a lot of people, the economic prosperity and so on. Realistically, if we're going to get people to move towards the circular economy, we have to put in those drivers. So working together to work out where the value lies for them and then trying to retain that when we're moving towards new offerings is really important. And then also in amongst that, there's the consumer element of that, but I think we're going to talk about that in the citizen aspect of this discussion.
We are, Rhoda.
So hopefully I answered all your questions.
Yes, that's wonderful. I just want to sort of like just dig just a little bit deeper on that, and then we must move on to the next topic. You talked about linking supply chains together. Now, designers have not necessarily been working in supply chains or thinking about how the supply chains connect. How do you see that happening?
I think actually it's a really good role for designers. So a really good skill that designers have is acting as a conduit between different people. So we're quite good at translating language from one stakeholder to another, and we can bring stuff together and then we can turn it into design features and functions and so on. So we can see the opportunities that come from conversations. The work that we've been doing recently when bringing supply chain actors together is really just putting them in a room together and getting them to document their supply chain and allowing those discussions to flow, and then asking them to document where their social, economic and technical value sits within those activities, so that we can work out which of those activities are important and which we can play with from an ideation point of view in order to bring in that circularity. So it really is as simple as getting them in the room with somebody there that can translate the inputs from all various stakeholders and then turn that into design opportunities. So I see it as a really important role for designers, actually.
Okay, fantastic. Quick question on that. You also mentioned values, understanding each stakeholder's value. Now, does that turn into new values when we talk about a circular economy, or are we talking about old values here that you address somehow?
So I think it's really important to document the old values, because this is what is important to companies. So we need to get companies on board with moving to a circular economy. So we need to see again where the economic prosperity for their particular activity sits, where the social benefit comes, and what their personal values are when it comes to these approaches. But then we can work out how far we can move them towards the circular economy, the different options that we can do. If it comes to refills and reuse models, you can kind of work out where you're going to place those systems along the supply chain, and who's up for it, and who needs a little bit more persuading, and so on. So it's about documenting old values, as you called it, but then also highlighting areas where new values can come in.
To a certain extent, identifying those opportunities for kind of like nudging and persuasion, right? Something like
yes.
this.
Yeah,
okay.
Exactly that.
Awesome. Rhoda, I'm going to move on now to our next topic, which is longevity. And for that, I'm going to turn to Mia. I'm going to ask you, Mia, once the materials, resources and processing are in the system, how and what experience have you had with keeping these in the system, such as to retain what is made, then to extend this, perhaps through repair, reuse, or to remake, for example?
Thank you for that question. That's very interesting. So in my study, I interviewed experienced retail and hospitality designers, so designers who are working in the field and who has been working in the field for many years. And in the beginning of the interview, I asked them about sustainability. Do you make sustainable design? And many of them would say, yes, I think my design is sustainable because I create very exclusive fashion stores, for example, and I use marble or natural stone on the floor. I make sure that the stores can last for many years. So they would think that that's a sustainable design, using exclusive materials. Also using natural wood, for example. If you use these high-end materials, you're also able to maintain them during the lifetime. So if you make a fashion store and you use natural solid wood, or you use brass, or you use natural stone, you'll be able to polish it and to make sure that the store keeps looking nice. But what they didn't touch upon was circularity. So they didn't think about after the life of the store that they would have to bring these materials back into the system. So it's very obvious if you take wood, if you take a natural stone out of a mountain, you'll not be able to put it back. You might be able to keep it in the system for a longer time, but the designers would only think about it until the end of the store. They wouldn't consider how to get the materials back into the system. That's not a part of their practice.
Right, so yeah, very much the sort of like the luxury model. It's the same actually in fashion. Sort of the argument is that if you use great materials, then they'll last a long time and it will stay for a long time.
Yes.
So, but what about if we look at sort of like the different lifespans? Because your expertise is also sort of like in exhibits and interiors. And here we see a lot of tear down. So what are we talking about here in terms of like turnover?
Yeah.
And in terms of like keeping these materials in the system.
So these designers worked with exhibition design, retail design, hospitality design. Exhibitions, of course, they might last only for 1 day, 2 days. Then you tear them down, and you don't know what to do with the materials. You might have intentions that you can use the same materials again. You can use the same exhibition again. But to create an experience that is unique for the customers or the visitors of that experience, very often you won't be able to reuse the materials in the same way. So that is an example of a life cycle that is very short. Fashion stores, they may last for maybe 3-5 years. Cafes, maybe a little, hotels, maybe a little bit longer, depending on what type of store it is. And for all of these projects, as it looks right now, the designer is not involved in the recycling process. So they are not designing for demolishing these products and these materials again.
So as yet, the designer is not thinking about full life cycle in terms of like the design.
No, they're not, and they all admit that, and they say we really would like to do. I actually showed them the same video as some of you saw before, and after having been introduced to the concept, they are very motivated and they really want to do it. But they say we lack knowledge, and we also don't. We don't have the system for handling this.
I was going to get to that actually, sort of like infrastructure then. So there aren't any infrastructures in place in, I mean, most of your work is in Denmark, is that correct?
So it's international stores mainly. If it's in Denmark only, it's a little bit easier because you will know how to handle waste, and you'll know how to separate different materials. If you work internationally, then the rules will be different. So that's another thing that we need to address when teaching designers about a circular economy, is that rules are different in different regions.
And have you found sort of like in your work that sort of like infrastructure is in place in most places, or not at all?
No, I would say not at all.
Okay.
So they would all say the designers who I interviewed, they would all point at other stakeholders to handle this process for them. They would say, well, the supplier needs to help us to make sure that the materials can go back, or supplier will need to provide us with the knowledge that we need to have about these materials, or politicians will need to make rules about this, because then it will be the same for everyone creating these stores, for example, if it was defined by law.
So how would you then describe the designer's role in terms of being able to transition towards this circular economy?
So the designers are extremely motivated. They really want to participate. And I also asked them about creativity, and would this hinder their creativity? And they actually, all of them said no, because we are used to working with different barriers, and we're not worried about that at all. We just need more knowledge about it in order to get started. Some of them would even say, we do look for, there's a lot of information about sustainable materials, and we do look for new materials all the time, but some of them would even say we are a little bit worried about using these, because there's also a lot of greenwashing going on, and we are just afraid to tell our clients to use a specific material if it then turns out to be not as green as advertised.
So at the moment, we could like summarize longevity in the fact that sort of like designers do not seem to be connected to infrastructures whereby they can kind of like retain, reuse products in the system.
Yes.
And still we're just designing for the linear economy.
Yes,
as such.
exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
I would like now to turn to Anne Boddington to address the issue of the role of design schools, what is happening now and what might happen as it relates to these two areas of zero waste and longevity, whereby we've just discussed sort of two specific ecosystems, and I'm sure Anne's got more areas to add to that, but in terms of like how we look at that now in terms of what it means for education, design education. Anne, thank you.
Thanks everybody. Nice to see those I can see on screen. I'm going to start in a slightly different place just before I tackle education, which is, there are two bits to this, circular and economy, and we have to bring the two of them together, and we tend to talk about circularity independently from the economy. And one of the points I was making in my lecture yesterday, and that's why I brought in the donut economics, was that we have to look at GDP growth, which is one of the things that causes most of the issues that we discuss. And for a long time, I've been thinking about that in terms of the responsibilities of education more generally. And we have to look at, I think, the education system exactly in the same way as we look at global economics, in what Kate Raworth would call the donut, which is that education has finite resources too, and if we want to invest better in research, and we want our faculty to have more time to do research, we need to think about the circular economy of education. And what I mean by that is that actually we still run what I would describe as a 19th century model of higher education, and actually all education to a certain degree. In that we still kind of run, whether it's modules or classes, and we teach the same thing every year. And another set of students come through, like the sausage machine of GDP. And GDP growth and the way we run education are very, very similar. It's a sausage machine of not a very helpful kind. And the reason I think this is an interesting proposition is to say, and the proposition I'll put on the table, and then I'll kind of rewind to explain it, which is, if we taught every student to teach, and if we taught students to teach one another, and that we were a different kind of facilitator as designer and educator, we would have a lot more people talking about the circular economy a lot quicker. And it doesn't matter whether in the end graduates teach their children, whether they teach their community, or whether they teach their best friend. But what you're doing is increasing the volume of those who teach in a circular manner. And this comes back to a real sort of set of cultural issues that we have to deal with in education, about what we say and what we do. And what we say we do is we put the student at the center of everything we do, and I would challenge even that. And I would challenge that for a simple reason. At the end of the day, it's a teacher with students. And in most situations, irrespective of anything else, we don't even, and we can't even define what the design skills are that we deliver. And I would challenge most design schools in the world to say that actually what a student can do at the end of a course is not actually tested. It's delivered, but it's not tested. And one of the really interesting things about teaching, and I'm old enough to be able to say this now, I've been in higher education for far too long, which is probably why I'm now retired, but is that you know what you don't know the minute you try and teach it to somebody else. And it's really quick. You can be the best expert, you can be the best researcher, but if you cannot translate that for others, you fail actually as a teacher at the end of the day. And you know that most of us have had one or two brilliant teachers in our lives, and that's what gave us the structure. So I look at education rather like I look at giving gifts. I never give a gift to anybody I wouldn't want myself in that kind of context. But it means that we have to think very differently about education. And one of the propositions, as I say, is to teach everybody to teach. What most people talk about when they talk about teaching the circular economy is doing what we're doing now, which is talking about it. But we don't talk about what we actually have to do. And I've done a number of projects actually on literally zero waste. One was to set up a restaurant with a colleague of mine, which is still running, thank God, despite the pandemic. And I built a house out of other people's rubbish on a university site with, I think, about 700 participants. And that used nothing but waste and waste products. And those two things are really good examples. And we did that really with virtually no money in both cases. But it was all about how you look very in a circular way about delivering education. And that's true at every level. We have to question really everything from, the idea of a course or a module. Course or a module, we should actually be evolving in a circular model. And value in that context is about learning, not about money. But by working with groups in a much more research-focused way, in other words, that the students and the member of staff, if you like, or the teacher or the researcher or the academic, however you want to describe them, actually work with students to learn together, rather than that it's a teacher facilitating or extolling their knowledge in a classroom. And I think that's a very, very old transactional model, and it looks exactly like any other linear system. And we've got to find a system which is actually, the thing that's interesting about this, and it's interesting seeing all your diagrams, because I'm old enough to have been brought up by a war generation. My mother was in the war. She looked after children in the war who were orphaned. And one of the things she would never let us do was waste anything. I was brought up in a culture which didn't allow me to throw anything away. And the key, it's very interesting then to start a restaurant, which I did in Brighton and is now in London, and has moved to London, which actually had no bin. There was no bin in the restaurant and nothing ever got thrown away. And that was the principle of the restaurant. And I would say to everybody, the first thing that everybody can do is to remove the bin and then ask themselves how they shop, how they work, what they do, and you will find a whole series of things will shift in terms of a culture. So it's actually asking that question of education and not looking just at financial value, but also at how we consider value in terms of learning, in terms of knowledge, but also in terms of the expansion of knowledge in that sense. So it's kind of how do you roll out and scale up knowledge very quickly? And one of the ways is to teach other people to teach in order that they teach other people. You see what I
And
mean? That's a very circular argument.
no, that's great. So sort of like turning circularity onto ourselves, and what I took out of that then is sort of like, it's very much learning by doing. It's actually bringing the radical into the teaching. You use the sort of like the bin, exactly, sort of like no bin, and you know, it definitely gets radical reactions. I remember the Got Milk campaign in San Francisco. I forget the name of the advertising agency, but it was an award-winning campaign whereby you know, everybody likes to have a drop of milk in their tea or their coffee, and of course everybody congregates around the coffee machine, and then of course there's no milk, and so sort of like basically out came the sort of like the advertising campaign of Got Milk. But there were a lot of frustrated advertising people hanging around the coffee machine without milk for weeks. So okay, so radical change to the educational system. So this is what I took out, and you can correct me if or add to this. But sort of like, it's very much learning by doing. You gave an example of building out of waste, but like in terms of sort of like, how do we build like without making waste as such, not at the end of the line, but sort of like, how do we actually build without making waste? And then if we think of it from the start as opposed to sort of like the reuse. And then there's this multi-dimensional learning, which is basically we can all learn together. And so how do we all learn together? And that sounds as if one needs to take a little bit of risk with that, because if we're all learning together, then no one knows the way. And so the pathway is extremely new to everybody. So there is a little bit of risk in that, which then comes back to the safety, the psychological safety, which I think you also brought up, Anne, in your keynote, which was amazing and marvelous to think that we could have, you know, this safety net of taking risk and exploring different ways of education. Would you like to add anything else to that, Anne, or would that be an okay summary?
Yeah, I mean, I think the issue that it's radical. I mean, I think I use the term carefully radical and radically careful. We need to do both. And I think loads of people talk about being radical, most of them aren't. They just haven't read the stuff, actually. I mean, I'm sorry to be really cynical about this. Well, not cynical, actually. It's just that we have to do the intellectual labor. Circular economy is actually old news. It's very, very old news. What we've got to do is bring it back into our culture. And it's actually something that in many cultures around the world, and actually Hong Kong, China, India, have cultures that actually had a circular economy a long time ago. What we've done is build ourselves out of it into some global economy that is all about GDP, and all about GDP endless growth. And that's the bit that really I think we have to get hold of in order to say, actually, we may be looking in the wrong place. And it's a cultural set of issues that we need to bring back. I mean, as I say, you know, I said it yesterday, and it is about psychological safety. It is about the idea we take risks. Unfortunately, at the moment, only the privileged take risks with taxpayers' money, and quality and money don't necessarily sit on the same page.
Anne, you are starting to sound very cynical now, so I'm going to stop you there before we go even darker times. It's that time, you know. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring us back to the 4 areas that we're discussing, but I do want to thank you, Anne, because I think that everything that you say is definitely something that we should be considering here. So ways to return resources back into the system, and I'm going to quickly return back to Mia for that, to ask her to discuss ways to return this back to the system, and understanding that this is very radical to the way that we do things today. It might have been the way that things were done in the 1930s, when there were no resources, when there was little access to food. But those days are gone, and we now have sort of like very different sort of like generation here who are used to having this take, make, dispose society. So trying to not necessarily turn the clocks back, but how do we reinvent this is definitely what we're trying to get at. So the return loop, that's what I just asked you to discuss, and you have touched on that a little bit. Is there anything that you would like to add to that?
Yeah, so during the discussions that I had with the designers, it became very obvious that the return loop is not something that they are aware of. And one thing is that once they have designed something, the product or the interior, the materials, they are out of their hands. So they say, we don't own the stores, we don't own the cafes, we don't run the cafes. So we don't even know when they're closing them down sometimes, or when they're being demolished. So we don't consider that. But they did start to brainstorm a little bit during the discussion about maybe we could do things differently. And one designer was employed in a big design agency that also produced the furniture and implemented the stores. And it was all the stores were for a brand that had stores in Europe, in Central Europe. So she started to think, oh, maybe we could, instead of just designing and producing and implementing the stores and then say now it's not our business anymore, maybe we could actually rent them the furniture and we could take it back afterwards, and in that way keep the materials in the loop. If their suppliers would be if they could get their suppliers on board, maybe they could change that business model. And I think that is what is important, that designers start to think about different, or businesses start to think about different business models. But another thing is that designers need to design for disassembling, to make sure that even though they are not in charge of the entire life cycle of the product or the interior, they still have to have in mind that one day these materials need to be taken out of the store again, or the exhibition needs to be torn down. So some materials are more obvious in order to consider circularity than others. A material like this carpet, for example, on the floor here, that would be quite easy to remove afterwards. But if you had instead used an epoxy material, that material would stick to the concrete, and we would never be able to remove that again. And if we wanted another material on top of that, then we would place that on top of the epoxy, just leaving the epoxy there for future generations to take care of.
I want to come back to basically your service model. So this has been linked with the circular economy instead of sort of actually selling. So now everybody sort of like rents or hires or leases. And this is the model, the sort of like the new business model that you were just talking about, with sort of like renting the furniture or leasing the furniture in some way. But we talked about this earlier, and you were talking about the cluster, because in this particular cluster, there is a sort of like almost a vertical. It's not just the designer. The designer is linked with the production, linked then also with the collection and the recycling as such. So what they're looking at is increasing their business stretch. Is that correct? Did I understand that right?
Yes, that is one possibility. So it depends on the position of the designer, of course. Some designers are independent designers. They work on their own and they only do a design, and then they give that design to the client, and then the client takes care of it. But many designers work in close cooperation with suppliers. So I think that the cooperation with the suppliers and the local communities and the government in the local areas is very important for designers to gain knowledge on, to make sure that they in whatever community you're working, that they know how to handle waste in this geographic area, because it's different from city to city, from country to country.
Yeah, I think that this location thing is basically sort of like you've got to understand sort of like where you are, where you're located.
That's also what makes it difficult to make general education program about this, because it will be very different to teaching this in Hong Kong and teaching this in Copenhagen or in the UK.
But that's very nice. It's where the regionality starts to come in, and then we start to build up these clusters as opposed to a global linear system. Rhoda, I'd like to bring you back in here just very quickly. Do you have anything to add to the return loop? Otherwise, I'll move you straight on to the citizen's role. Can we have Rhoda back up, please? Hello.
Sorry, I'm terrible at unmuting, aren't I? Yes, hello. I think, yeah, I mean, I agree with everything about that Mia was talking about return systems, and that it's asking organizations to rethink their business models. But actually, I think there are lots of great opportunities with return systems and asking organizations to do that, because it suddenly means that they are able to build better relationships with their customers. And I think that that is always a good thing for organizations. Is anything that can get you closer to your customer is always of benefit. So I would always see bringing in return loops as a really good opportunity for companies.
I mean, we have to like bring in the return loops, right? I mean, otherwise we can't get to the restorative, regenerative perspective of, you know, what, as Ellen MacArthur's sort of like foundation has sort of defined the circular economy. But in any case, as scholars write, that this is the most difficult loop to close as such. But by doing that, I mean, we can only by doing that can we actually reach sustainability in terms of the circular economy, right? Rhoda?
Yes, well, we need to be able to keep resources within a system. That's what the circular economy is, so that we can reuse them again. And building in return loops means that we can get hold of those materials again, so that we can reuse them in whatever way, be that through refilling them, repairing them, remanufacturing them, or recycling them. Obviously, we want to be able to get those back. And actually, it also gives a very good opportunity in terms of the circular economy, because as soon as you start building in a bit of ownership of materials to companies, then it's suddenly really important for them to increase the quality of the resources that they're using, and selecting materials that then make it easier for them to repair and refurbish and recycle them. And suddenly the quality of the resources that we're using globally goes up, recyclability gets easier, design for repair becomes easier, so that we start, so that longevity then grows, and it all starts working really nicely together. So, so yeah, ownership by companies of resources, I think, is a really good opportunity to really support a circular economy.
Okay, we're not going to talk about this now, but at some point, sort of like, we have to have another panel and talk about sort of like how we persuade companies to actually do that, and how we sort of get the regulations and the policies in place to support that. Rhoda, I'm going to keep you on here, because now I like to move to sort of like how designers view the role of citizens. And I know that sort of like with the work that you've been doing with food and food packaging, that you've really been sort of like exploring that. And I think that would be great if you could touch on that. And really, yeah, thinking about sort of like what it is that you're trying to do from a designerly perspective, yeah, with citizens, really. How are you engaging them in these transformations?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's two arms of that discussion. You sort of said specifically the role of designer in bringing the citizen in. But actually what we're finding a lot of is it's bringing an understanding of the citizen or the consumer into organizations that's really important. Because we can design things to work in a particular way, but actually we need to understand what people are doing with it. And people are inherently tricky and don't behave in the same way. And there's cognitive and contextual factors that change the way that we behave, just to add in a little bit more trickiness. You know, we like to behave one way when we're at home, and then one way when we're at work, and one way when we're out and about. So we don't necessarily behave with materials in the same way all the time. So it's really important to understand that, because that's the end point of your product or your piece of packaging or whatever. And so any return loops will probably require a consumer or a citizen to do something with that material. So we need to be able to understand that. And what we found over the last few years when we've been looking at consumer behaviour is that the way people behave when they're observed is very different to the way that they report that they behave, especially when it comes to sustainability or circular economy areas. So if you were to give them a questionnaire to say, you know, what do you do with your waste, they would tell you that they would recycle all the things that can be recyclable, and that they are very, you know, that the sustainability is very important to them and they do their best. But when we watch them in reality, you know, they might be eating at their desk, they might have a really important report that needs finishing, they might be in a park and only have one bin available and they don't want to put it in their bag because it's got leftover food residue in it. And so they might just chuck it all in landfill. Or we also observe really random behaviours of people being tidy. So they'll buy a series of items of food, and at the end of their meal, they'll put it all into the bag that it came in. So you've got mixed materials going in one bag, and they'll scrunch it up and they'll put it in the recycling bin. But actually those materials are then really hard to separate and recycle. So it's really important to understand current behaviour with products and packaging and food, and current behaviour within the specific context of the organisation. So what we're trying to do with the projects that we do is build some methodologies that different organisations can use, because we can't make generic statements about this. We can kind of pull it back to, you know, people behave differently in different contexts, and depending on their level of education and their lived experiences and so on. But we can't really tell different disciplines and different areas how people are going to behave. They need to go out and find that for themselves. So it's about developing methods. So we need to understand how people are currently behaving, but then when we're moving to a circular economy, we also need to think about how we want people to behave. So we want them to take something back to store. We want them to start leasing a product rather than owning it. We want them to start sharing things with their neighbours so that you only have to buy one, or we want people to wash stuff out and refill it in store. So we've got this desired behaviour. And then we need to work out the distance between that way that they currently behave and how we want them to behave. And then we need to talk to consumers to find out how far they would be willing to go towards that desired behaviour, and that's so that we don't get any unintended consequences. If we're making stuff to last longer, we're probably making it thicker with a bit more resource. If that is then being thrown away, then actually we're creating bigger impacts rather than making inroads to reducing the impact of that product. So what we would always say as designers, taking the designerly role towards it, is it's always really important to undertake live trials with any new offering. And those live trials need to be within the context of use. So the project that we're doing at the moment is on food to go packaging, so sandwiches and sushi and stuff that you eat outside of the home. So we would then undertake live trials with new packaging formats where they get to take it back and eat it at their desk. They get to throw it away when they're having conversations with lots of other people, or they're walking through a park and don't know what to do with it, or they're eating it in the car, so that we can make sure that the behaviour that we want is okay for them to do. And we sometimes refer it to the hassle factor. So the value of the experience has to be greater than the hassle factor of what we're asking them to do with that item or that piece of packaging. So really, it's about talking to your consumer and collecting lots of information from them and then trialing new solutions with them.
Rhoda, thank you so much. I'm realising we are so out of time here, and I really want to come back to Anne now. Rhoda, thank you. Anne, can I ask you to come back? Would you?
Really interesting hearing.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can
Yeah,
hear
okay.
you. I'm going to come back to this. Well, should I ask you about education again? Perhaps you could sort of like help us in terms of, I can see this, you know, you're sort of like concerned that nothing's happening, but at the same time, perhaps we might say also that designers are still not getting the education that they might need, especially over here in this part of the world, to help them to understand to actually make that happen. It's very different from the situation over in Europe. And so I would say that there are some steps that we could take to kind of improve knowledge and learning. And I think you gave us some great ideas in the first round. But let's just imagine that sort of like in this environment, sort of like people are, they are most definitely motivated, but they don't have the tools or the know-how to actually do it. And having said that, I would also say that we don't have that many discussions on that topic over here in the way that they are being had and have been had in Europe, and the development that's happened in Europe compared to the development here. It's very different development.
Well, I think in some places that's true. I think that the sorts of things that Rhoda's just talked about, though, or indeed Mia, I think there are some really interesting questions around that. And one of them is, I mean, if I work backwards the other way, so just listening to Rhoda talk about the hassle factor, which I think is a really, I mean, the whole issue of how you tackle a kind of consumer or a user behavior is fascinating. And I think, you know, a lot of the circular economy, for example, is focused only on materials, and that's a critique I would have of the circular economy project that I chair. Is it's all about material cycles rather than about how people use them and how they're kind of engaged. So it's one critique, which is to say, rather than thinking about user-centered design as in what the consumer wants in that sense, but looking at how the consumer behaves might be a really interesting kind of shift in content terms, in terms of how we talk about education, which is one thing to maybe consider. I think the other one, which is an aesthetic one, which I'm always fascinated by the shifts that happen in aesthetics, and one of them for me, which I find quite entertaining in a sense, is that, you know, the idea that now ripped jeans are the most trendy thing on earth. You know, i.e. old jeans that have been used, ripped, or even ripped from new, dare I say it. Old furniture or things aged for the sake of aging, so a new material that's aged rather than an aged material. So I think there are some really big issues around around how we link, one, the consumer or the user, or however we want to describe those people, and indeed what students expect from a design education. And that's one of the, so if we treat, for example, education as a business, which it is in lots and lots of ways, what do students expect when they come into a design school? And I think all too often they think they're going to be kind of trendy superheroes, and I think that's got to stop. I think they've got to be responsible designers, and we don't market that right, but we also haven't the evidence, and that was the thing I was talking about yesterday, of the difference we can make and do make. We still don't really deal with that. We make lots of claims that design can save the world. Unfortunately, it can't save the world on its own.
No.
And we need to be much clearer about the evidence, and much more, and not just talk about it, but do it. So we've got to live it. And that's why I think we have to live it in different ways, at different scales. And I think we've got to think about that in schools, and that's why that's where the psychological safety comes from, which is a real sense of dialogue rather than it looks like dialogue, but actually it's all about me,
And
which is one of the things that I think is important.
And I want to just ask you this. Are there some good examples? Which design schools or universities do you think are educating in a way which has moved towards the education system that you've just described to us earlier, which is turning circular back on ourselves? Are there some good examples?
I think very few in the sense of the system itself, the educational system. I think there's lots of people now delivering education around the world, whether it's transition design at Carnegie Mellon or the kind of work that Rhoda and her colleagues are doing, both, and they do both material circular economy and consumer circular economy at Loughborough, for example. And you can see bits of it, but it's in the content and it's in research. It's not in the delivery of the fundamental delivery of education. My point is that the only way to expand that is to do something about the pedagogy itself, and that's what I'm driving at. Is that actually when you start to look at the value in pedagogy and have a conversation about a different aesthetic, a different way of appreciation, and a different philosophical conversation, actually, that it doesn't even just talk about consumers, but talks about users, about communities in a very different way. And as I said yesterday, how we collaborate in a very different way, and what that craft looks like. We're looking at the kind of wrong end. We're still behaving like consumers in higher education. So we've got to start behaving like citizens, if you like, in higher education. And treat learning as a value, as something to value in a very different way. And we've turned the whole thing into just the most super global business, and thinking very hard about, and that's where all the research integrity stuff I was talking about yesterday comes from, how we tackle some of that such that education is repositioned globally. And that's a hard thing to offer. And there are lots of experimental school models, like creative models, like the sort of cooperative models that are looked at. I mean, there is one, I think, in Spain that's a cooperative education model, but we haven't worked out the economy of that, and that's a really big question.
And I'm going to stop you there, because that's a brilliant place to stop. We have to change the economies. We need diverse economies, and I think what I've understood from this is that it's not just business, it's not just these global supply chains which we talk about as business as such, but education is part of that business, and we have to turn that back on ourselves. And so it's the economy of the educational system that we also have to question. I love that. That's great. And so that would lead us to diversity of economies for educational institutions. And then that dribbles down, it sets the frame for how we educate our students. Could be one interpretation of what you just said. Okay, we are so done with time here, but I would like to, first of all, we have some word clouds that we could put up that at least give us some sort of like frame of the discussions that we've had, and the sort of like the areas that have popped through in terms of the areas of waste, of longevity, and returning to the system as we've discussed it. And so sort of like, as we can look up here, sort of like at waste, longevity, return to the system, and citizens, we sort of like see the words, and sort of like return is sort of like material and design, material very big on longevity, and we looked at sort of like packaging for waste. I mean, this reflects sort of like the conversation that we've had. And then basically in terms of like citizens, obviously we have people and behave. So in any case, sort of like we thought we'd show this. And then for education, we have Ipsum coming up again. All right, so that would be lovely if we have education. Probably we're waiting for that to run through, are we, given the fact that we've just stopped it? We have to close this. We do have one questionnaire. Is it at all possible that people could sit with us just 1 second longer just to give us their feedback on a questionnaire? It is basically 1 or 2 minutes.
It's a lot shorter than the first one.
You have to put the, oh, you've done it. There. There, it's a lot shorter. It's very short, in fact. We would love it if you could just fill it in for us. It would be wonderful. Thank you, Criddy. All right, we've got 5 responses. Has this panel inspired you? Well, okay, maybe. Maybe and yes. So, well, okay, we tried. How might you implement the circular economy in your practice? Well, I think that even if we got a few more sort of like respondents on have we inspired you, might be good. We'll have to think about that as we move forward. Oh, that's good though. How would you implement the circular economy? My practice in a more systematic way. Inspiration for my upcoming participatory design class. That's cool. Are you inspired or motivated to learn more? Yes. Oh, well, that's good. Even if you don't want to implement it, that's good. So actually, everybody wants to learn more about the circular economy. So that's 100% turnaround. And what areas are most interested to learn about? Oh, well, I missed that. No worries. I'm going to close this panel. I've got to thank everybody for being here. Thank you for sticking with us and being live and being online. Rhoda, Anne, tremendous. Thank you very much. Mia, thank you so much.
Thank you all.